The day Della Garrett laid eyes on Thomas Tucker across the crowded schoolyard in Kelton, Utah, she knew with the certainty of a 16-year-old heart that she had glimpsed her future. What she couldn't have known then was how the rolling thunder of war drums would test that certainty, or how 7 years could feel like both a moment and an eternity when waiting for someone you love to come home. The spring of 1860 brought more than just wildflowers to the Utah Territory. For Della, now 18 and helping her father with their small general store, it brought Thomas Tucker back to town after his 2 years working cattle drives to Colorado. He rode in on a dappled gray stallion, his lanky frame taller than she remembered, his boyish features hardened into those of a man. The town of Kelton was still small, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the stagecoach stop and newly built telegraph station, but it felt like the center of the world when Thomas dismounted in front of her father's store. "Miss Garrett," he called, tipping his hat with a smile that made her hands tremble as she arranged cans of beans on the shelf. "I don't suppose you remember me?" Della turned slowly, willing her voice not to betray her. "Thomas Tucker. You used to pull my braids in school. And you used to make me eat dirt for it?" He replied with a laugh that carried across the years. "Seems we've both grown up some." Mr. Garrett emerged from the storeroom, brushing flour from his apron. "Young Tucker, heard you'd gone off to make your fortune." "Not much fortune to be made punching cattle, sir," Thomas answered, his eyes never leaving Della's face. "But I've saved enough to buy old man Peterson's place. Thought I might try my hand at raising horses." "That's so?" Mr. Garrett's eyebrow raised as he glanced between the two young people. "Well, I expect you'll be needing supplies then." Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir, I surely will. And perhaps—" he hesitated. "Perhaps your daughter might advise me on what a proper home needs. I'm afraid my knowledge runs more to horse tack than household goods." That afternoon marked the beginning. Thomas purchased more supplies than one man could possibly need, and Della wrote each item carefully in the ledger, her neat handwriting a contrast to the wild beating of her heart. As spring melted into summer, Thomas became a regular visitor to the Garrett home. He'd come for Sunday dinner after church, hat in hand and hair slicked down with water. Mrs. Garrett served her best chicken, and Mr. Garrett gradually stopped cleaning his shotgun whenever Thomas appeared at the door. Their first kiss came on a July evening beneath the cottonwood tree behind the church. The town had gathered for Independence Day celebrations, and as fireworks crackled overhead, a luxury brought in special by train from Salt Lake City, Thomas led Della away from the crowd. "I never thought I'd come back to Kelton," he confessed, his voice low against the background of distant cheers. "Not until I saw you that day in your father's store. Then I knew I'd never want to leave again." When he kissed her, Della felt as though the fireworks had found their way inside her chest. His lips were gentle at first, then hungry with the passion of a man who'd known what he wanted for a very long time. By autumn, everyone in Kelton knew Thomas Tucker was courting Della Garrett. They made plans in whispers, dreams shared on walks along the newly laid railroad tracks. He'd bring her wildflowers from the hillsides, and she'd bake him pies with berries she'd gathered herself. "I'll build you a proper house," he promised one evening as they sat on her father's porch swing. "With glass windows and a real wooden floor. No dirt floors for my Della." She leaned against his shoulder, inhaling the scent of leather and horse and the soap he used only when coming to see her. "I don't need fancy things, Thomas. Just you." "You'll have both," he insisted. "I've already ordered lumber from the sawmill in Promontory. By spring, we'll have walls to call our own." The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but nothing could dim their happiness. At Christmas, with her parents' blessing, Thomas formally asked for Della's hand. The small diamond ring he presented had cost him nearly all his savings, but the tears in Della's eyes as she accepted made every penny worthwhile. April, they decided. We'll marry when the apple blossoms come. January brought heavy snows and news of secession in the far-off South. February thawed the snow but brought more troubling reports. By March, when President Lincoln called for volunteers, the distant rumblings of conflict had become impossible to ignore. Thomas and Della sat by the fire in her father's parlor, his face grave as he held her hands. "They're saying it'll be over quick," he said, his voice unnaturally steady. "A few months at most." Della felt cold despite the crackling flames. "You're not thinking of going?" It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "I have to. Delegate men are volunteering all over the territory. Utah isn't even a state yet. This isn't our fight." Her voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "It's every American's fight." He squeezed her hands tighter. "I can't sit here building our house while other men are dying for what's right. And what about what's right for us?" Tears spilled down her cheeks now, unchecked. Thomas pulled her close, his heartbeat steady against her ear. "I'll come back to you. Nothing in this world could keep me away." They were married the next day, a hasty ceremony in the small church with only her parents and his mother as witnesses. The apple trees were still bare, the promise of blossoms only a distant hope. That night, in a room above her father's store that her mother had hurriedly prepared, they became husband and wife in more than name. "I'll write every day," Thomas promised as dawn broke, his body tangled with hers beneath the quilt. "And when I come home, we'll have that house with glass windows." 3 days later, she stood at the newly built train station, waving until his uniformed figure disappeared into a cloud of steam. The lumber for their house lay stacked and waiting beside the foundation he'd already laid. True to his word, the letters came regularly at first. Tales of training camps, of marches through Virginia countryside, of comrades from places with exotic names like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. Della read each one until the paper wore thin, then carefully stored them in a wooden box beside their marriage certificate. She moved into the small cabin his mother kept, the two women finding solace in shared worry. Together they tended the vegetable garden and cared for the horses Thomas had begun to breed. Each evening, they read from the Bible and prayed for his safe return. Summer passed with news of battles in faraway places: Bull Run, Wilson's Creek. Autumn came, and Thomas's letters grew shorter, the handwriting more hurried. Winter settled over Utah territory, and the letters became less frequent. By spring, when the apple blossoms finally appeared as they'd once planned, word came only once a month. "The fighting is worse than they said it would be," he wrote in April of 1862. "Men I've shared meals with one day are gone the next. But I'm still whole, still coming home to you." In June, a telegram arrived instead of a letter. Della's hands trembled so violently that Thomas's mother had to read it aloud. "Sergeant Thomas Tucker, wounded, stop, condition serious, not critical, stop, recovering, Washington hospital, stop." The next letter, written in an unfamiliar hand, explained that Thomas had been shot at a place called 7 Pines. The bullet had torn through his left shoulder and another had grazed his face. He would live, but recovery would take time. "He asked me to tell you he's keeping his promise," the letter concluded. "He says to tell you he's coming home." Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, and still Thomas remained in the hospital. His own letters resumed eventually, the handwriting shaky but determined. "The doctors say I'll keep the arm," he wrote, "though it may never be as strong as it was. As for my face, well, you may have to get used to a different-looking husband. I don't care if you come home with 2 heads," Della wrote back fiercely. "Just come home." 1863 brought the worst news yet. Thomas had been well enough to rejoin his unit, only to be captured at Gettysburg. For 6 months, no word came at all. Della continued working in her father's store by day and praying beside Thomas's mother at night. The war that was supposed to last months stretched into years. Kelton grew as the railroad expanded, bringing new faces and businesses to the once tiny town. Della watched young couples marry, watched babies being born, watched life continuing all around her, while her own remained suspended between hope and dread. Thomas's mother fell ill with pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1864. Della nursed her day and night, but by February, the old woman was gone. Della buried her beside Thomas's father in the small cemetery and moved back to her parents' home, unable to bear the emptiness of the cabin alone. The unfinished house, its lumber now weathered gray, stood as a monument to broken promises and deferred dreams. Some nights, Della would walk there beneath the stars, running her hands over the foundation stones Thomas had laid with such hope. In April 1865, news of Lee's surrender rippled across the country. Della stood in the telegraph office as the operator received the message, tears streaming down her face as townspeople erupted in celebration around her. "They're coming home," people kept saying. "Our boys are coming home." Days passed, then weeks. Soldiers began to trickle back to Utah territory, some whole, some missing limbs, all carrying shadows in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Della met every train, scanned every face, then returned to her father's store with shoulders a little more slumped each time. In July, a letter arrived from a hospital in St. Louis. Thomas was alive but had been severely ill with camp fever after his release from a Confederate prison camp. He was recovering slowly and would come home when he could travel. "I'm not the man who left you," he wrote in a scrawl barely recognizable as his handwriting. "I fear what you'll see when I return." Della pressed the letter to her heart. "I don't care," she whispered to the empty room. "I don't care." Summer faded to autumn. The 4th anniversary of Thomas's departure approached. Della turned 26, no longer the girl who had waved goodbye at the station but a woman hardened by years of waiting. Some nights, lying awake, she wondered if she would even recognize the man she'd married after all this time. On a crisp October morning in 1865, Della was arranging a display of canned goods when the bell above the store door jingled. She turned, prepared to greet another customer with her practiced smile. A tall man stood silhouetted in the doorway, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His left sleeve was pinned to his side, the empty space where an arm should have been immediately apparent. As he stepped into the light, Della's practiced greeting died on her lips. Half of Thomas's face remained as handsome as she remembered. The other half bore a web of scars that pulled his left eye and mouth into a permanent grimace. His once dark hair was streaked with gray, though he couldn't be more than 30 years old. "Hello, Della," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered but unmistakably his. "I told you I'd come back." She moved toward him slowly, afraid he might disappear if she rushed. Her hands reached up to touch his face, fingers gently tracing the path of scars from temple to jaw. "Thomas," she whispered, and it was both a question and an answer. His good arm came around her waist, pulling her close with a strength that belied his gaunt appearance. "I wasn't sure you'd still want me," he murmured against her hair. "Wasn't sure you'd waited." Della pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. Those, at least, were unchanged. The same deep brown she'd dreamed of for 4 long years. "I've been waiting for my husband to come home and finish building our house," she said firmly. "And now he's here." That night, in her parents' parlor, Thomas told his story in halting sentences. The battles, the wounds, the prison camp. How gangrene had taken his arm despite the doctor's efforts. How he'd nearly died 3 times over. How the thought of her had kept him alive when nothing else could. "I can't work like I used to," he admitted, staring down at his single hand. "Can't build that house I promised you." Della's father cleared his throat. "The store needs a manager," he said casually. My eyes aren't what they were, and keeping the books has become a challenge. Thomas looked up sharply. I don't want charity, sir. It's not charity to hire the best man for the job, Mr. Garrett replied. You were always good with numbers, as I recall, and Della knows the merchandise better than anyone. Between the two of you, I expect business would improve considerably. Later, as they walked beneath the stars to the foundation of what should have been their home, Thomas stopped suddenly. I can't give you what I promised, he said, his voice cracking. I'm half a man now. Della took his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. You promised to come back to me. That's the only promise that ever mattered. That night, in the small room above the store where they had first become husband and wife, they rediscovered each other. Thomas was hesitant at first, ashamed of his scarred body, but Della's touch held no revulsion, only love. Her fingers traced each mark as if memorizing a map that had led him back to her. I love you, she whispered against his skin. Every part of you. The next morning, Thomas woke to find Della already dressed and pulling on her coat. Where are you going? He asked, still half asleep. We're going, she corrected, tossing his clothes onto the bed. To see our house. The foundation stones were still solid, though weeds had grown up between them. The lumber, stacked nearby and covered with canvas, had weathered but remained usable. I've kept it all, Della explained as Thomas walked the perimeter, his cane leaving small divots in the soft earth. Paid boys to replace the canvas when it wore thin. Hired Mr. Peterson to check that nothing was rotting or being stolen. Thomas turned to her, his expression a mixture of wonder and pain. Della, I can't build it now. Not with one arm. No, she agreed, stepping closer. But you can tell others how to build it. And I've saved almost every penny I've earned these past 4 years. You want to hire builders? She nodded. The railroad brought plenty of men with those skills to Kelton. Men who need work now that the main line is finished. Thomas shook his head slowly. It was supposed to be my gift to you. Something I built with my own hands. The best gift you could give me was coming home alive, Della said firmly. This house will build it together. The way we'll build our life together. As autumn deepened toward winter, the house began to take shape. Thomas supervised the work, his experience from before the war proving valuable despite his disability. Della worked in the store by day and joined him at the building site in the evenings, making decisions about windows and doorways. The town watched with interest as the structure rose, walls going up, a roof appearing before the first snows came. Former soldiers passing through on the railroad sometimes stopped to help for a day or two. Men who recognized in Thomas the same haunted look they carried themselves. By Christmas, the exterior was complete. Glass windows, 6 of them, reflected the winter sunlight, and a proper wooden porch wrapped around the front. Inside, the floors were laid and walls divided the space into rooms. It's bigger than I planned, Thomas admitted as they stood in what would be the parlor. I was thinking of just a cabin before. We needed more rooms, Della replied, leaning against his good shoulder. For the children we'll have. He stiffened slightly, then turned to face her. Children? You still want that? With me as I am. Thomas Tucker, she said, taking his hand between both of hers. I want everything with you. Everything we dreamed of before you left. Everything we've waited for. They moved into the house on New Year's Day, 1866. The furniture was sparse: a bed, a table, some chairs, but it was theirs. That night, as snow fell softly outside, they lay together in their own bed for the first time. I thought of this moment every day I was away, Thomas whispered, his arm holding her close. It kept me alive in that prison camp. The thought of coming home to you. Spring brought new beginnings. Thomas proved adept at managing the store, his head for numbers compensating for his physical limitations. Della worked alongside him, the two of them building the business as they had built their home. By summer, Mr. Garrett was talking of retirement, of leaving the store entirely in their hands. In July, the doctor confirmed what Della had suspected for weeks: she was expecting their first child. Thomas received the news with a mixture of joy and trepidation. "What kind of father can I be?" he asked that night as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies rise from the grass. "I can't even pick up a child with these arms." "You can hold our baby in your arm," Della corrected gently. "You can tell stories and sing songs. You can teach everything you know." As Della's body changed with the growing child, so too did Thomas. The nightmares that had plagued him began to come less frequently. The tension he carried in his shoulders eased. He spoke more openly about the war, sharing stories not just of horror but of brotherhood, of moments of unexpected beauty found amidst devastation. Their son was born on a clear February morning in 1867, nearly 6 years after Thomas had left for war. They named him William, after Thomas's father, and he came into the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered, carefully cradling the swaddled infant in his arm. "Look what we made, Delaware." As William grew from infant to toddler, Thomas discovered he could do more than he'd imagined. He learned to change diapers one-handed, to balance the boy on his knee while reading stories, to guide small fingers as they reached for objects. The cane gave way to a surer stride as his body continued to heal and strengthen. The store prospered under their management. When Mr. Garrett officially retired in 1868, he signed the business over to them completely. Tucker's General Goods read the new sign Thomas proudly hung above the door. More children followed Elizabeth in 1869 and Michael in 1871. Their house expanded along with their family, new rooms added as needed. Thomas might have only one arm, but he had learned to work alongside the builders, contributing more than just supervision. The scars on his face faded somewhat with time, though they would never disappear completely. Della came to see them not as disfigurements but as part of the map of their life together, evidence of the journey that had brought him back to her. Some nights, Thomas still woke gasping from dreams of battle, of prison camps, of dying comrades. On those nights, Della would hold him until his breathing calmed, until he could remember where and when he was home, safe, loved. In 1873, as Kelton continued to grow with the railroad's influence, they added a millinery section to the store. Della's eye for fashion proved as sharp as Thomas's head for numbers, and soon women were coming from as far as Salt Lake City to purchase her carefully selected bonnets and accessories. "We should expand again," Thomas suggested one evening as they reviewed the ledgers. "Maybe add furniture, higher quality pieces than what's available now." "Always thinking ahead," Della teased, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "Remember when all you wanted was to raise horses?" He smiled, catching her hand before she could move away. "I wanted you more. Always you." Life wasn't without its difficulties. Thomas's war injuries caused him pain in cold weather, and sometimes the memories overwhelmed him, sending him into dark moods that took days to lift. The children asked questions about their father's scars, about the empty sleeve pinned to his side, and they had to find age-appropriate ways to explain the realities of war. But there was joy too, abundant joy. Watching William learn to ride his first pony, seeing Elizabeth master reading before she even started school, hearing Michael's laughter as Thomas spun tales of his cattle-driving days. There were community dances where Thomas proved he could still waltz with the best of them, Della held securely in his one arm. There were Sunday picnics after church, and Christmas mornings around the fireplace in the home they had built together. As the children grew, so did the stories. Thomas told them of his time in the war, not glossing over the horrors but emphasizing the courage he'd witnessed, the friendships forged in adversity. He wanted them to understand both the cost of conflict and the value of principles worth defending. Della told them of the waiting, of how she had kept faith during the long years of separation. "Your father promised he would come back to me," she would say, her hand finding Thomas's as it always did when they sat together. "And a Tucker always keeps his promises." In 1875, nearly a decade after Thomas's return, they took their first real vacation, leaving the store in the capable hands of their now retired parents and traveling by train to San Francisco. They stood together on the beach, watching the Pacific waves crash against the shore, Thomas's arm around Della's waist. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" he asked, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the surf. "After everything?" Della looked up at him, at the face she had loved in so many different forms, as a boyish troublemaker, as a hopeful young man, as a battle-scarred veteran, as the father of her children. The left side still bore the marks of war, the permanent pull at the corner of his eye and mouth, but she saw only Thomas. "I always knew we would," she replied, reaching up to touch his cheek. "From that very first day you came into the store and pretended you needed my help choosing supplies." He laughed, the sound free and unburdened in a way it hadn't been for many years. "I did need help. I just needed you more than I needed the supplies." They returned to Kelton refreshed, ready to face the next chapter of their lives. The town was changing, growing more established as Utah moved toward statehood. Their children were changing too, William showing interest in the store's operations, Elizabeth developing her mother's eye for fashion, Michael revealing a talent for working with horses that reminded Thomas of his own youthful dreams. In the spring of 1876, as the nation celebrated its centennial, Thomas and Della celebrated 15 years of marriage, though nearly half of those years had been spent apart. They hosted a gathering in their expanded home, filling it with friends who had supported them through the dark times and rejoiced with them in the good. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch swing Thomas had finally built the previous summer. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his arm around her shoulders, "about selling the store." Della turned to look at him, surprised. "Selling? But it's doing so well." "Exactly. It's at its peak value." His fingers traced idle patterns on her sleeve. "William's nearly 10 now. By the time he's old enough to take it over, who knows what will have changed. The railroad might shift its main routes, or newer towns might draw business away. What would we do instead?" Thomas smiled, the scars on his face shifting with the expression. "Remember Peterson's old place? The one I bought when I first came back to Kelton. The horse farm? But you sold that years ago." "I sold the house and most of the land," he corrected. "But I kept 40 acres on the north side. Been paying taxes on it all these years." Della sat up straighter. "Thomas Tucker, are you saying you want to raise horses after all?" "Not just horses." His eyes gleamed with an excitement she hadn't seen since before the war. "The Army's always looking for good mules, and there's still demand for quality riding horses. With William and Michael to help, and what we've saved over the years, we could build something special." "And what about me and Elizabeth in this plan of yours?" Della asked, trying to sound stern despite the smile tugging at her lips. "Why, you'd keep running your millinery business, of course. But from a new shop we'd build on our own land, where the stagecoaches would stop specially to let the ladies buy Della Tucker's famous bonnets." She laughed, leaning against him again. "You've thought this all through, haven't you? Had plenty of time to think during those years away," he said, his voice growing serious. "Promised myself that if I made it back to you, I'd make every day count. No more putting off dreams." By the fall of 1876, they had sold the store to a young couple from back east and moved to the property Thomas had kept all those years. The land was good rolling hills with a year-round creek running through it. They built a sturdy house first, larger than their town home, with bedrooms for each child and extra space for guests. The first horses arrived in the spring of 1877, two quality mares, and a stallion Thomas selected personally from a renowned breeder in Kentucky. William, now 11, threw himself into learning everything about horse breeding and training. 10-year-old Elizabeth surprised them all by showing an aptitude for gentling even the most skittish foals, while 6-year-old Michael seemed to have an instinctive understanding of what made each animal unique. As Thomas had predicted, Della's millinery business continued to thrive from their new location. She converted a small outbuilding into a charming shop, and word spread quickly that Mrs. Tucker's fashionable bonnets could now be found at the Tucker Horse Farm just outside Kelton. The work was hard but satisfying. Thomas found that years of adapting to his disability had made him resourceful in ways he'd never anticipated. He designed special equipment that could be operated one-handed, taught the children techniques he'd developed, and discovered that his eye for a good horse was as sharp as it had ever been. There were setbacks, of course. A harsh winter in 1879 took two valuable mares and their unborn foals. A fire in 1880 destroyed one of the barns, though quick action saved all the animals. The children fell ill with scarlet fever in 1881, frightening Thomas and Della more than any business disaster could have. But there were triumphs too. Their horses began winning ribbons at territorial fairs. The army signed a contract for a dozen mules to be delivered annually. Wealthy buyers from as far away as San Francisco made the journey to Kelton specifically to purchase Tucker-bred horses. As the years passed, they watched their children grow into adults who embodied the best of both parents. William, serious and mathematical like his father, took over the business aspects of the farm. Elizabeth combined her mother's fashion sense with her own talent for horse training, developing a lucrative sideline in ladies riding horses specifically matched to their owners' temperaments. Michael, the dreamer of the family, became known throughout the territory for his almost supernatural ability to gentle troubled horses others had given up on. In 1896, when Utah finally achieved statehood, Thomas and Della traveled to Salt Lake City for the celebrations. At 55 and 53 respectively, they were no longer young, but neither felt old. Decades of active work on the farm had kept them fit, and if Thomas's war wounds pained him more in cold weather now, he rarely complained. "Did you ever imagine this?" Della asked as they watched the fireworks explode over Temple Square, her arm linked through his. "When you came home so broken, did you think we'd have all this?" Thomas looked down at her, at the face he'd loved for more than half his life. Her hair showed streaks of silver now, and fine lines framed her eyes. But to him she was still the girl who had waded through a war that changed everything except her love for him. "I hoped," he said simply. "When hope was all I had left, I held on to it with everything in me." That night in their hotel room, as they prepared for bed, Thomas paused before removing his shirt. Even after all these years, he sometimes felt self-conscious about the scars that mapped his torso, the empty space where his left arm should be. Della came to him, her fingers gently unbuttoning his shirt as they had thousands of times before. "You're still the handsomest man I've ever known," she said softly, pressing her lips to the puckered scar on his shoulder. "And you're still a terrible liar," he replied with a smile, pulling her close. "But I love you for it." The turn of the century brought changes to the Tucker Horse Farm. William married Sarah Johnson, the schoolteacher from Kelton, and they built their own home on the northern edge of the property. Elizabeth, to everyone's surprise, fell in love with a cavalry officer who came to purchase horses for his regiment and followed him to postings across the country, though she always returned home for extended visits. Michael, the youngest, showed no inclination to marry, content with his horses and the increasingly complex breeding programs he developed. Thomas and Della gradually stepped back from daily operations, though both remained involved in the decisions that shaped the farm's future. They traveled more to San Francisco to visit Elizabeth when her husband was stationed in the Presidio, to Chicago for the World's Fair in 1893, even once to New York City, which Thomas declared too crowded by half and Della found thrillingly modern. In 1911, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, or as Thomas liked to say, 50 years since we wed, minus 4 years the army borrowed me. The celebration brought family from across the country, including Elizabeth's 3 children and William's 4. The farm was filled with laughter, music, and stories that connected the generations. As night fell and the younger folk continued their dancing in the barn, Thomas led Della away from the noise, down the path to the creek where they often walked in the evenings. The spring air carried the scent of wild roses, and a full moon silvered the landscape. 50 years, Della mused, her hand warm in his. Sometimes it seems impossible. Some days it felt impossible, Thomas acknowledged. Those years in the war. There were times I was sure I'd never see you again. They reached their favorite spot, a smooth boulder beside the creek where they had sat through countless conversations, decisions, dreams. Thomas helped Della settle beside him, both of them moving more carefully now than they once had. I've been thinking about those early days, he said, watching the moonlight dance on the water. About that foundation we laid before I left, and the house we finally built when I came back. Our first real home, Della smiled at the memory. It seemed so grand at the time. It was. Thomas turned to face her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. But what we've built since then, this farm, our family, our life together, that's the real foundation. That's what will outlast us. Della leaned her head against his shoulder, her silver hair mingling with his. I used to dream about you coming home. During the war, I'd imagine you riding up, whole and unmarked, like you'd never left. I'm sorry I couldn't be that man for you. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not. The man who came back to me scarred and changed but still loving me the same. He was stronger than the boy who left. He taught our children about courage and perseverance in ways no untroubled man ever could. Thomas's throat tightened with emotion. How do you always know exactly what to say? 50 years of practice, she replied with a soft laugh. And a lifetime of loving you. They sat together as the creek bubbled past, bearing witness to a love that had endured separation, war, disability, and the ordinary challenges of building a life together. Their story was woven now into the very fabric of Kelton, into the bones of the farm they had created, into the lives of their children and grandchildren. You know, Thomas said after a comfortable silence, when I first came back from the war, I was afraid you'd see me as half a man. Never, Della said firmly. Not for a single moment. I know that now. He squeezed her hand gently. You saw me whole when I couldn't see it myself. You gave me back my future. We gave it to each other, she corrected, rising slowly from the boulder and tugging him to his feet. And we're not finished yet, Thomas Tucker. Not by a long shot. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the lights of the farmhouse, toward the music and laughter of the celebration still in progress, toward the next chapter of a love story that had begun with 2 teenagers in a small frontier town and grown into a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The scars remained on Thomas's body, in both their memories, but they had become simply part of the tapestry, threads in a pattern more beautiful for having overcome the tears that might have unraveled it. He had been her first love before the war took him away. The cowboy had returned scarred but still loving her the same. And in that love, they had found healing, purpose, and a happiness neither could have imagined during those dark years of waiting. As they reached the edge of the lantern light spilling from the barn, Thomas paused, drawing Della into his arm for a moment. I love you, Della Tucker, he said simply. Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows. And I love you, she replied, the words as fresh and true as they had been in their youth. Always have, always will. Together, They stepped back into the light, into the celebration of a love that had endured everything life could throw at it, and emerged not just intact, but triumphant.